Good morning, I'm Lindsay Stevenson. I'm here live at the 2017 Women's Global Leadership Summit, and today joining me is Lionel LaRoche, and he is doing an excellent talk later about multicultural communication, and so we're pretty excited to have a discussion with him today and share that with you. So I'm just going to start off. Can you share with us a little bit about what does multicultural communication mean? What does that look like?
Well, fundamentally, the fundamental idea is very simple. The way we've been brought up and the way we've been taught throughout the educational system that taught us has way more of an impact on the way we think and communicate than most people realize. And in particular, obviously, the choice of language is an important one, but more importantly is the way we were taught to frame our ideas and phrase them. Okay? So I'll give you a simple example because otherwise it's theoretical. Every zoo around the world has somewhere a sign that asks visitors not to feed the animals. The question is, how did the staff decide to word that sign? So, because the message is clear, don't feed the animals. But how do they word it? So in the Toronto Zoo, the way it's worded is like this. Please refrain from feeding the animals for the following reasons. Then bullet points, you have 5 reasons. First one, if you give them food with a wrapper, they might choke on it. Second one, they might get germs from your hands. Third one, they won't be hungry for the food prepared by the nutritionist. There's 2 more reasons which I forgot. Then the sign concludes. For these reasons, we appreciate your collaboration in not feeding the animals. Thank you. Now, that's very typical of the way Canadian will phrase, don't do it. In France, the same sign will say this. It's strictly forbidden under no circumstance to feed the animals. Violators will be expelled immediately and fined. So the message is the same. Don't feed the animals. But it is worded so differently that if I'm used to it's strictly forbidden under no circumstance to feed the animals, and I see a sign that says, oh, please refrain from feeding the animals for all these reasons, then what I take away from the sign is very different from what the sign wants me to understand. What the sign wants me to learn to think is don't feed the animals. What I take away from it is, well, they prefer I don't do it, but if I wash my hands, remove the wrapper, and don't give them too much, it's okay. Okay? And so we run into those difficulties in many, many circumstances, particularly in the workplace. Okay? Between manager and employee, between co-workers, teammates. In the accounting world, a lot of work is done in teams, and being a good team player means entirely different things in different parts of the world. So, the challenges that people run into the workplace is this. They have different ideas of how things are supposed to happen, and because of the way they were brought up. And when they work with people who were brought up in different parts of the world, they have different mental models of how the world works, and they end up with conflict, issues like missed deadlines, like unmet expectations, and so on and so forth.
That's totally fascinating. I'm super excited. I cannot wait for this session. So tell me a little bit more about what it looks like when we're aware of it. Now we understand that somebody has a different mindset, their education has been different, and so they see the same words and interpret it a different way. So now how do we restructure our own communication so that we can address that? Like what can I do to make sure you don't feed the zoo animals?
Yeah. Well, I'm not suggesting that people act preemptively. Like what I mean by that, because otherwise they'll end up stereotyping. Okay? If you go, oh, this person is from France, they're used to this, so I'm going to communicate this way, you'll end up creating a problem for yourself sooner or later, because yeah, this person is from France, but they've spent 30 years in the US, and so they know the typical way of communicating in the US, and they will be offended if you tell them, don't feed the animals. So the important part is to remember that the message that is received may not be the message that was meant to be sent. So if you're the one sending messages, like you're communicating, for example, with a client or a coworker, well, what I want to encourage everyone to do is observe. Is the impact you have the impact you want to have? And if the impact you have is not the impact you want to have, stop and clarify. The temptation is very big at that point to just keep going, hoping it will get better by itself. Okay? Most of the time, it doesn't. It gets worse. People get offended, and things get snowballed. Okay? So if the impact you have is not the impact you want to have, stop and clarify. Okay? On the receiving end, what I want to encourage everyone to do is to remember, you know, we always talk about giving the benefit of the doubt. What does that mean concretely? Well, big thing is separate impact from intention. The way you feel may not be the way the person meant to make you feel, and vice versa. So concretely, what does it mean? There's 5 feelings that I want to encourage everyone to consider as red flags that you may have misunderstood what the person meant to tell you. So we're talking about you're feeling annoyed, impatient, frustrated, offended, or disrespected. I'm not suggesting you should not feel this way. That's not at all my point. But when you feel one of these feelings, treat them as a red flag that may indicate you may have misunderstood what the person meant. So dig around it to really understand what is their intention, and then deal with those feelings. Don't just act on them, like react spontaneously. Oh, I'm offended. It's like, that may not be what the person meant to do, okay?
Okay, so let's backtrack just a little bit. And when you were talking about observe, and so explain a little bit to us about what does observe look like? What are we looking for?
That's a great question. So what I found is when we are for example, where it's really striking will be you're trying to sell a project to a client. And that client belongs to a cultural group which is different from yours, all right? What I found you end up having to do, you're in the meeting and obviously you're selling your project, you need to be acting. You can't, but at the same time, you actually need to be observing. So what I found is multicultural meetings in that respect takes a lot of brain power, if I can put it that way, because you are an actor, you're also an observer. You're observing what impact what's going on the other side, and you also need to observe what's going on inside you and your team. Okay, so it takes a lot of mental processing, but it can be very helpful because you can pick up on signals that things are not going the way you want them to go, and kind of catch it before it goes totally off rails, kind of thing.
Okay.
Off the rails.
So is there a way that as we prepare to have these multicultural discussions without stereotyping anyone, is there a way that we can practice this or practice that observation skill and recognizing those things?
Practicing the observation skill is that is something we can do anytime. Okay, you can do it in regular meetings with your colleagues, even if they're from the same cultural background. There will be times there will be misunderstandings. I mean, husband and wives have misunderstanding continuously, right? And it just happens. So this is the same concept. It's just the more different the educational system, the people involved went through, the more likely you are to have these misunderstandings. So the practicing the observation, that you can do all the time. If you want to prepare yourself, let's say you want to sell a project to Chinese organization or French organization, whatever, then it does help to have some preparation for the team to understand kind of what are the norms and what is how will those ways of thinking, and not just like, for example, if you work with Japanese, everybody knows by now that, if you work with Japanese, you bow and you give them your business card with 2 hands. That is kind of the visible part of the iceberg. I'm talking about the invisible part of the iceberg. So for example, what does a good presentation look like to Japanese people? How do they like the information to be provided to them? Like, how much information will be needed? Okay, if you're trying to sell to Japanese people, you'll see quickly that they need far more information to make a decision than the average American company will need to make the same kind of decision. Okay, being ready for that is an important element, because it's quite common for people to say, forget it, it's just too much work and it's not worth our while. Well, it all depends on whether you look at it short term or long term. So understanding what is likely to be expected or what's likely to happen, but not look at it as do's and don'ts. Like,
sure.
Kind of, this is, usually it's, you have a bell curve. There's the average, and then you have a standard deviation. So understanding both the average and the standard deviation is very helpful in preparing for that kind of meetings.
So if our listeners today are thinking about what they need to do and a thought that you could leave them with, is there some place that they can research these different cultures in terms of business, things to be prepared for, things to understand? Is there a place they could go to find that?
Well, I mean, they can contact me for sure.
Contact Lionel. You heard it here, folks. He's the one to come talk to.
Yeah, no, I mean, seriously. There's a number of books on topics. Like if somebody's interested in Japan, well, there is a book on looking at the differences between, the United States and Japan. You can find a book on the difference between the United States and Spain, and so on and so forth. Books, I find, are really very effective because you can condense a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time. Videos, I find this is too complex a topic for people to follow, to watch a 5-hour course online kind of thing. Okay, typically. Okay. So yeah, books would be definitely a place to start. There's a number of people like me, consultants, who do work in this area, and I'm sure any one of us will be happy to help anybody who's interested in learning more about that topic.
Well, today has been incredible. You guys have heard from Lionel about multicultural communication. I hope you found this session enlightening, and the Human Intelligence series will continue with more great insights, so please join us again.